Knowledge is having the right answers, intelligence is asking the right question, and wisdom is knowing when to ask the right questions.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
Yeah, we haven't worked out what we say after that bit because after 140 episodes of saying the same thing. Gareth,
Yep.
Good to see you. You've been out and about a bit. I've just got back from Malaga, which was very exciting.
That must have been hard.
It wasn't, actually, if I'm honest. But there's been lots and lots of travel going on recently, so it's quite nice to be back in our leafy Oxfordshire. How are you doing?
I'm off to Germany on Monday.
Are you?
Yeah, for 2 weeks.
That's very exciting. So lots of Wurst and kartoffel and things like that.
Absolutely. So having said I am now back, I'm clearly not.
Look at that, the complexities of life getting in front of us. Well, listen, this was an episode that you prepped me for 4 months ago, I think it was.
A while ago,
started. Do you want to talk about what you wanted to talk about this week?
Yeah, so the title of the episode is Data versus Intuition. And I think it's a really important subject. And I think this is something that we've talked about, but not specifically focused on many episodes in the past. And we definitely talk about information informing decisions and part of leadership and strategy and all of these things. I think there's a really important discussion about when you should use data and information to inform decisions and when it's appropriate to use intuition, experience, gut feel, whatever you want to describe it as, but those human factors and human elements that override or disagree with what the data is telling you. But I think what's interesting is exploring when it's appropriate to do that.
It's a particularly relevant topic for us today because I was in an interview not long ago and I was asked, tell me how you would use data to make decisions. And I had an answer, and we'll no doubt touch on some of those things a little bit later on. But I was really, really sensitive at the time that this is a really loaded question these days because everyone has a very, very strong view. Data is something that we talk about now more than I did 10 years ago. 10 years ago, people kind of talked about data, but it wasn't relevant. Now it does feel like it's quite a loaded question. And so I need to think about that question and how I answer it because I have a very pragmatic answer, which to no surprise to anyone is exactly what you've just said, which is there's an element of intuition which you need. In fact, not just intuition, but experience. That's perhaps a better word, as well as an element of data. But if you said to me, do you believe data is king? I'm going to pause a little bit and say, well, as with all things, if you said data is the only thing that matters, I'd be nervous with that. And if you said intuition is the only thing that matters, but it fits somewhere in between. So actually, what's interesting for me about this discussion is not that there's a definitive answer, but it's exploring that middle ground. How do you best combine those two?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that's important to talk about is what do we mean by data? And we've had this discussion before as well. So data is the plural of datum, which means a fixed point. But of course, what we mean by data these days is the thing from which we make information. So quite often when we talk about data, we are implicitly talking about digital data. So we're talking about the zeros and ones that underpins binary logic in computing, in the cybernetic system. But of course, data is more than that, and it can be the patterns of activity in the physical world as well. The thing to recognize is that data is ubiquitous. It is everywhere, and it is about everything. And as we aggregate and measure data in particular ways, we create information. And that's how we create our understanding of the world around us. So the first thing to recognize is that there are different types of data, and therefore it has different value based on what you're trying to do with it.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah.
Because that's really, really important to me, which is if it sounds as we go through this recording that I'm feeling uncomfortable because I am not a data expert, and I mean I'm not a data scientist, but I get lots of people who kind of almost make out that they're data experts. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure you're seeing the bigger picture. So going back to your point about different kinds of data, in my product world, there are lots of different kinds of data, and I'd almost not push back, but I think it's almost more complicated than there's just ones and zeros. So, for example, historically, data was sales numbers. How are we doing with our sales numbers? And people will be shouting and saying, that's a lagging indicator. That doesn't help you, which is all great. But fundamentally, that is a piece of data that says, how much have we sold? That's great.
Well, I would actually say you're already starting to now talk about information, because the data are the raw numbers. And it's how you aggregate, measure, and interpret those that creates the information, and then how you use that information to influence decisions is then when you start.
Do you know what? That's beautifully framed. I need to get better at framing how I think about these things. That's brilliantly said, and I can hear your intelligence background, which is exactly about it. So yes, there is data where someone tells you how many units we've sold. And if you have sold more than you sold last month, then you've got some interesting information. Yeah. Here's another one. This is the one that everyone gets excited about in my world right now, which is Pendo. Have you ever come across Pendo?
No.
So Pendo is some software which is very well known. It's used, frankly, by most of the major organizations. And every organization I've worked in for the last 15 years, 10 years, let's say, certainly, they've used Pendo. And Pendo allows you to instrument a piece of software. Historically, it was websites, but you can do it with other things. What do I mean by that? What it allows you to do is to understand how people are using your software.
Right.
And the way they often describe it, and by the way, if there's anyone from Pendo listening or use it every day, you'll say I've done a terrible job describing it, but literally, if I'm going on to, let's say, a banking website and I click in 5 different places, it remembers where I've clicked and it can see where I'm going. Yeah. So it can do all sorts of interesting things. It knows who I am. And so it might say, Chris Kitcher has just logged on to this website. Let's call it a website for now. And Chris hasn't logged on for 3 months and we've got 3 new features. So it knows that. And it says at an appropriate time, I'm going to pop up a message that says, hello, Chris. Here's 3 new features. So that's interesting. Okay. That's valuable. Yeah. It's not data per se, but it's using data to figure out who I am and where I am.
Yeah.
But the bit that, getting back to our point, is I can now go back as a product manager and I can say, for this particular type of customer, for this cohort, which is described by user type or whatever it might be, show me where they went. And it can say 85% of people go on this journey through your site. Oh, nobody cares about this feature, but everybody cares about this feature. And then it can start to get really clever. So first of all, by the way, that's really valuable for, as product people, to understand we might imagine how people use our software, but we don't know how people are actually using our software. And then there's a final piece which becomes extremely powerful, which is, let's say I was going to pay a bill and it turns out that 50% of my customers get to this screen and then don't actually transfer any money. Yeah. Why is that? Oh, it turns out the user interface isn't great and half the people get frustrated and stop. So Pendo is a really good way of telling you how people are using your site.
Yeah.
And going back to your point about data, it gives you data, but you still have to infer insight or intelligence from the data.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good start point for, like, we now understand what we're talking about when we talk about using data to make decisions.
Well, can I go back, because this is my world through and through.
Yeah.
I think there are lots of people that if I gave that as an answer and say, well, we use Pendo, everyone would get very excited. Well, hang on a minute. That's only giving me one type of data, which in itself means I can only derive certain intelligence. So here's another thing that historically we used to do before Pendo is instrument our software. So I used to work at Adobe and we would say, how many PDFs are people making? And so that literally is hooking in. It's not what a customer, as it were, has done through the application. It's literally how many things have happened, different piece of data. And then there's the third piece, which is, and this is, I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking this. third piece is you sit down with bloody customers, you watch what they do, and you ask them questions.
Yep.
That's not digital data
No, but
at all.
it's collecting information which is useful. And I think that's this is all sort of framing the argument for using data and, aggregating it into information to use it to make data informed.
That's exactly right. So if my answer in that original question when I was in this interview and they said, how do you do it, was all of those things.
Yeah.
Because each one gives you a different angle.
Yes.
And if you rely on one, you'll start to see different bits of the elephant and you still won't know it's an elephant.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's absolutely what I used to do when I did surveillance and reconnaissance work in the Marines. This was all about how do we understand what's going on using the access we have to data and information from the environment. And like you say, it's kind of that different parts of the elements of the elephant, and therefore you're trying to do what we used to call fusion, which is a really pompous way of saying we would
sticking it all together.
Different types of information gathering to make sure that we are getting the whole elephant. So you'd have signals intelligence, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is collecting electromagnetic signatures from the battlefield, communications, radar, whatever, other people's radars, identifying electronic signatures to understand where things are. You would have imagery intelligence. That could be space-based satellites, that could be drones, that could be people with handheld cameras, but taking imagery and then using imagery interpretation, so trained analysts to count the number of tanks or to see where the trenches are being dug or whatever the problem set was at the time. You then have human intelligence. So this is your traditional spying, running agents. So you would recruit sources, and these are very specialist capabilities and very sensitive, but you would try and elicit information. But it could equally be casual conversation. So a infantry patrol in a village talk to the locals, and the locals say, we saw this activity or we heard this last night. That in itself is a human information source. But the trick was to not only get all that information and aggregate it together and fuse it to work out what's going on. The trick in the first place is to know what questions to ask and where to put your sensors. And
this is going to be one of those episodes where I have to try and keep all of these ideas in my head. I want to slow you down because maybe take us down a side road. The way you and I have just spoken is that the answer to any question we might have is encoded in the data somewhere. And I know, and I'm a civilian, so I know this from reading things rather than because I know magical things. More and more people think if only we could get more data, we'd get a better answer.
So there's two elements there. One is, I think, what you're saying about not all answers are in the data in the environment. And the other one is about separating out more versus valuable in terms of data.
I'll even take one further step back, which is, and this is a valid conversation, by the way, and I want to make it very clear. I do passionately believe in gathering this data. And by the way, I'm going to steal your words the next time someone asks me about the difference between gathering data and deriving intelligence and insight. Yeah. And the fusion, I think, is a word that I've never heard people use in the product world, which is most people pick one data source and say, that's my data source. And I think your answer as an intelligence person is no. You need multiple data sources, you need fusion. But let's take one step further back. Here's my ridiculous statement to you. Well, this is easy, Gareth. We said this is data versus intuition. Bollocks to intuition. We don't need intuition. We've got the data. Why on earth would we need anything other than data? Yeah. Surely data is the only thing you need. And if you have a good enough algorithm and a good enough computer, you are good. We can chop the human being out of this because, frankly, they're a bit unreliable. What's your sense on that?
Yeah. So I gave a talk last week at a conference that was all about the integration of artificial intelligence into security software. Quite niche. But I gave a talk.
Nerd.
Yeah. And I felt, somewhat out of my comfort zone because there were a lot of data scientists, a lot of cybersecurity analysts, a lot of very, very capable, bright people within that very specific niche world. But the talk I gave was about complexity and about the fact that the answer to a lot of these challenges can't be solved with simply having the right data, because we're talking about complex and in some cases chaotic systems where the effect you have on the system changes the overall, the underlying parameters, a bit like the stock market. If you only needed the data, you would be able to create algorithms that would be able to beat the stock market. But of course, by doing that, and there are algorithms that, we've seen, crashes, big algorithmic crashes and all that kind of stuff. By creating an algorithm that plays the stock market, you've changed the fundamental underlying principles of how the stock market works. And now you're playing a different game. So there is an element of, there has to be an external decision process that is not just reliant on the data, not just reliant on the information within the system. And this is where there's a balance between what is going on and what have we previously understood, experience. And you can automate some of that. You can have predictive systems, but there are nuances between mathematical systems and human decision systems. So we have heuristics, we have biases, we have prejudices. We also have humor, we have creativity, we have instinct, we have all of those things that make us brilliantly human and also terribly human, mean that people behave differently. So what's, I think, really interesting is where those two things collide. And this is where decision making, you have to be really clear as to, is this something that can be solved? Is this a complicated problem that with enough maths, with enough data, with enough understanding of the system, I can work out the solution? Is there a mathematical solution to this problem? Or is this a creative problem? Is this one where actually there isn't a right answer, there are just various
and I
options?
suspect there are notches in between those things. I
Absolutely.
want to go back because I think this is really by way of an episode for me to practice the answer to how do you think about data. I love that point that said, if all you needed was data, then we would all be winning billions of pounds on the stock market. The fact that people haven't solved the stock market indicates it can't just be data in the certain circumstances you've said. I also think that, and I'm sort of looking at experience, I suspect there are lots of people that would fall at the complex versus complicated, because they would say, well, this is just a complicated problem, not a complex one, so data will solve it. Going back to your point, Google does an amazing job with a complicated problem of how long will it take for me. I'm driving to the Channel Tunnel next Wednesday or whenever the hell it is. How long will it take me to get to the Channel Tunnel? It does it to within a minute or two, because that is a complicated problem. However, it could still be out by 20 minutes if some human parks a car and another car on the M25 just before the exit. I think it answers that really important question, can you just live on data alone? The answer is no. And going back to your point, it's the fusion of the two. Before we go back to that fusion between the two, because I think that's where the real wisdom lies of how do you get that right, which of course is harder. But I want to go back to the data. And this is something I've certainly heard and seen in the military and in the security services, but I think to some degree is true in my world in business, which is there is almost this inevitable sense of if only we get more data, if only we get more data. From looking back in your past, you must have had this same problem, which is if only we could get a higher resolution satellite picture, if only we got some more human. How do you work out what is enough data? Because otherwise there is a risk you could spend all your life gathering data and not do anything with it. You could not gather enough data and make poor. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
How do you think about what is the sweet spot? How many of my hours in a day am I going to use, fundamentally going back to the bigger problem, gathering and interpreting data thinking about my own intuition and experience and doing work. You've only got 8 hours in a day. How do you judge, or how does the military judge what's enough and too much?
So I think the first thing to recognize is that you can't be omnipotent. Any kind of attempt.
Hang on. Are you telling me I can't be Wow.
Any attempt to try and understand everything all the time, everywhere, is just going to result in not understanding anything, anywhere, ever. So you have to be really focused on what you're trying to achieve. So what is it I'm trying to do? So understanding your goals, your purpose, your values. We've done whole episodes on this. And this is why it's about strategy. And this is my underlying kind of passion about strategy is not just a plan. Strategy is about uncertainty. It's about complexity. So what is it you're trying to achieve? And is this a complex or a complicated system? So if we think about something like putting a weapon system on a target, that is mostly a complicated problem. Like artillery, putting shells that do ballistic trajectories onto a target is a maths problem. Parabolas, and you need data and information about where you are, where the target is, wind speeds, etc., etc. But it's largely maths. So you need very specific information to be able to do that. But when you go from, right, now I can use artillery, the question is, where do I need to use artillery? What target?
Even the artillery one is an interesting example, because the reason why it's a complicated problem is because of hundreds of years of lobbing shells.
Absolutely.
And people say, well, after 100 years, we know we need these 6 pieces of data.
Absolutely.
And we've worked out the maths is complicated. Whereas many of the problems we encounter in business, they're novel problems. And so I don't even know whether this is a complicated or a complex problem.
But in warfare, like any competitive environment, nothing is fixed. So even though solving an artillery problem might be maths, and we might know what information and data we need, where is the target, what is the target, how far away is it, what altitude is it at, what's the wind speed between here and the, all of those things can be found, can be analysed, can be worked out. The enemy can move. How often are they moving? They can put deceptive targets out. They can put jammers out that mean that the centrifuges in the artillery shells don't work. There are things that they will do to change the system. And this is where commanders, with their intelligence staff, with their operations staff, with their planners, have to then start to play this human game. What is anticipating? What is the enemy doing? What are they likely to be doing? And learning from trends. And you learn from trends by receiving information. So there's this kind of constant dynamic of getting new information, using your previous experience, using your analysis of the data and the information, and combining those things. And there is a point where these two things meet, which we've talked about in the past, which I've said in the military we call operational art. And the reason it's an art is because it's that balance of knowing when is enough data, when is enough. When do I need to make these decisions, like time-wise? Do I have time to get the accurate information, or do I just have to go off enough, what I've got now, which might be a guess, it might be an estimate, it might be just, I'm going to probe the problem space.
But it is, by the way, I completely agree. And I think the analogy works very, very well with business, which is you could spend all of your time gathering this data, but the question is how much.
Yeah.
Really interesting that we've already, even if you have a world of data, let's pretend you have all the data in the world, which is difficult in itself, but let's pretend you have that. You still need human intuition / experience to understand which information you care about, which information you should focus on.
Yeah.
Here's one which I think for these kinds of things, we have quite strong views based on experience of these things. Here's one which perhaps is evolving right now. I would imagine that some people right now in the military, particularly with what's going on in the Ukraine, would say, well, I agree with you in principle, Gareth, this idea that intuition is the thing that says how often are they going to move? Are they going to do other things? AI can now do this for us. So with a combination of AI and data, don't worry, you don't need the squishy human-y brain bit because we'll take care of it. Not that this is sort of a binary yes or no, right or wrong. What's your take on that? Do you believe that AI we still don't need intuition experience because we'll have a computer with that? Or do you again think it's just another factor in the complexity of the decision-making process?
Yeah, I think it's just another factor. And the reason for that is twofold. One, AI is not an oracle. It doesn't have some superhuman magical ability to predict the future. So it is using mathematical trend analysis and vast amounts of data in a way that a single human brain can't do to interpret at machine speeds much, much faster at processing this data than a human could. And so it can do things that we can't do, really amazingly. But it is not able to predict the future because we're talking about that complexity, almost chaos. So it can only go to the point of what does the trends in the previous data sets tell it. It also is based on a world of data that was created by humans. I'm talking here largely about things like LLMs.
Yeah.
But it takes the data off the internet, which is all human created data, or it's AI created data, and there are feedback loops, and we're seeing a degradation of the veracity of data and increasing in AI slop and all that kind of stuff. And we can get into that. But I think what's important is to recognize that as soon as you do something that is unexpected,
novel,
creative, that might not be what the AI expects. I was talking to a academic yesterday, actually, who marks essays. And he was saying 5 years ago, 25% of the mark would be for the structure of the essay, the sort of formatting that you would expect of a postgraduate academic, being able to put an essay together. 25%. He says now that's not part of the mark because everybody can format an essay properly because AI just does it for you. And interestingly, the essays that are not formatted properly, the ones that have idiosyncrasies that 5 years ago would have been put down to laziness or human error, are now the ones that he says, I can tell this is not an AI enhanced essay. This is the one I'm more interested in. So we've almost got to this point where errors, human error, human inconsistency is the magic, is the thing that is interesting.
I like this idea because I think we're starting to find out what we're really good at humans. And I don't know that we'd ever really thought about that before. We assumed everything we did was really magical, and it turns out that formatting is not magical. That's just a pattern.
Yeah.
But novel thought. Just before my favorite story of the week, which I read, which I'm sure is AI slop, but we'll come back to that. I want to go back to the point, though. What you were saying a few minutes ago was a battlefield commander, I'm stretching this a bit, could not necessarily effectively be replaced by an AI because an AI relies
I don't think that's a stretch at all. I think that is accurate.
Well, I think your point was AI relies on patterns from the past and so therefore doesn't talk about...
Or the present. There are real-time data feeds.
Can I ask a different question, though? Because I think this is my experience over the last few years. Do you think a battlefield commander with an AI by its side can be more effective?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I think that's the real trick here.
And I don't think we can get away from that.
I don't think we want to, because I think the point is the battlefield commander that says, tell me what's happened in the past, and the AI that says, most of the time this is what's happened, here's a couple of other things, but now you go, I think that's the point I wanted to make. This is not AI hating, this is not data hating.
No, not at all.
It almost goes back to what we just said about the formatting. The leader, the manager, the decision maker that has the ability to take all of these inputs and make a good human decision is going to win against someone else.
Yes, and I think I would go as far as to say AI systems, machine decision systems, are an essential tool to modern complex problems. Whether you're a battlefield leader, a business leader, you have to include these systems into your decision-making processes. And the analogy I would use is a bit like the introduction of the machine gun didn't give one side over the other a competitive advantage in warfare. What it did is it changed the character of conflict and meant that both sides had to start thinking about new tactics in the age of mechanization, in the age of machine guns. Not having AI-enabled decision support as part of your decision-making systems is a little bit like going into battle on horseback with a lance when the enemy have tanks and machine guns. So I think my argument here is this is about balance, and it's about really understanding what advantages data and information can give you, but also where are the points where data and information alone are not going to solve the problem. And I just want, before we go to a break, I want to use a quote from Professor Richard Feynman, who is a theoretical physicist. He's a bit of a hero of mine. Scientist, so very focused on the scientific method, and so you would have thought would be very much in the data and information camp, and very much was. But also, and the reason that I like Richard Feynman so much is he was one of those great masters of his craft, his trade, but able to communicate it to the layman. And he was a brilliant communicator. But he said this, he said, knowledge is having the right answers. Intelligence is asking the right questions. Wisdom is knowing when to ask the right questions. And I think that's really important. And I think this idea of knowledge, intelligence as in cognitive ability in this case, and wisdom is a really important way of framing this problem. Because what we're talking about here is, where is the human wisdom really important to understand where we can ask the right questions and we can get the systems, the machines, the AI, the sensors, the data to answer and enhance our ability to make decisions. But where and when do we need to ask the right questions, and what are those questions? So we've talked a lot about why data isn't the sole solution. I just want to flip it over and say why intuition isn't.
Well, let's come back into that. Before we go to the break, though, this is my favorite story. I did a little bit of research, so I'm going to misrepresent this. I apologize, but it's brilliant. Did you hear about the DARPA research on robots detecting human beings and people in the military?
I may have done, I don't know.
So the story goes something like this. DARPA have created an AI system to detect soldiers on the battlefield, particularly those who are moving tactically or are camouflaged and things like that. And they trained this AI system for 6 days straight with thousands of data points around human movement patterns so they could know what it looks like. They literally watched Marines and they said, this is how they move. And then they got 8 Marines and said, we want, and I'm sure there were some generals there to improve and say, your Marines can do anything they want. Our robot will detect them. And so this demonstrates that AI in the battlefield can see everything that's going on. And so these Marines were told, we want you to go up and touch the robot without it seeing you. And they obviously were thinking, well, of course, this AI is too clever. Not a single one of the Marines was spotted by the AI, and they all touched it. And this is my favorite bit. They all used what we have talked about, novel creativity. They didn't say, well, I'm going to crawl slowly up to it. They said, what is it the AI won't expect? And so one of the Marines cartwheeled up to the robot and touched it. But my favorite one by far, and this is literally reported as such, is got inside a cardboard box, walked towards the AI model, and the bit that my favorite thing was, whilst giggling, and touched the robot. Now, a ridiculous example, but a salutary lesson to us, which is we have to remember human beings have this amazing creative ability to say, if these are the rules, how do I think about breaking them?
Absolutely.
And so by definition, this was a complex problem rather than a complicated.
And of course, what will happen now is you can create an AI system that will look for cartwheeling soldiers and cardboard boxes.
And they'll think of something else.
And they'll think of something else. And we're seeing this, that's a humorous example, but we are seeing this in Ukraine, in the current conflict between the Ukrainians and the Russians, where because of the ubiquity of uncrewed aerial sensors, drones, with AI enabled vision sensors looking for infrared signatures, sometimes completely on their own without a person in that system. You've got soldiers now walking around literally holding tents above their heads. They hang a torch around their neck so that they can see the ground below them, and they have umbrellas or tents. And that's how they walk around the battlefield. If you said that to me or a former soldier or a soldier 3 or 4 years ago, we're going to tactically move around the battlefield by walking around with umbrellas or by carrying tents above our heads, that would have sounded very similar to we're going to cartwheel across a battlefield so robots can't see us. It sounds mad. We're doing that in actual war at the moment. So this is about a competitive system. What I would say, though, just before we go to the break, is we've talked a lot about why data isn't always the solution. I also want to talk about why instinct, gut, and intuition isn't. And there is a lot of, it doesn't happen quite so much now, but maybe that's just because I use social media less, but there used to be lots of memes, or maybe it's just I'm not the right demographic, but there used to be lots of memes about trusting your instincts. And I've just looked up a few. Always trust your gut. If you feel something is wrong, that's because it usually is. And there's loads of these memes.
Well, I tell you what, let's come back after the break.
Always trust your gut reaction. Bad vibes, intuition, hunches, instincts. If you feel something is bad or wrong, that's because it is. Like, these are great memes. And in, very specific circumstances, they're probably quite useful. In other circumstances, this is terrible advice. This is absolutely not the way to, how do you invest your pension pot? Always trust your gut reaction. Bad vibes, intuition, and hunches. I would say absolutely not the right approach.
Well, look, let's go away, take a quick break and come back, where we're going to talk about why human beings are absolute idiots. Welcome back. I think I left us with the dramatic statement that human beings are absolute idiots. But I think the first half, we framed the problem of data versus intuition. We started talking about the data. We started talking about why data is magic and gold, the challenges of collating and fusing the data. But also we started sort of, I think, towards the back end of the first half, making this point that data in itself isn't going to solve the problem, and that you need, and you've used the word intuition, but I want us to move towards the word experience, because I think experience is the grown-up version of intuition. Experience says, I have enough data points that I can derive something interesting. But
I want to push back on that slightly. So I think experience is, there are different ways of interpreting it. But experience might be a conscious process of recollecting previous memories, thoughts, and then consciously thinking through something. Intuition is about your subconscious brain, your subconscious system making decisions. Now, I think experience can play in both your conscious and subconscious.
Well, I was going to say, for me, it's about experience playing into the intuition. Going in and saying, I've never come across a road before and I'm on a corner, my intuition tells me I'm not going to die if I step out in the middle. Experience says, I've crossed a load of roads before. My intuition says, I probably won't die. Do you know what I mean?
So I don't think experience is the grown-up version of intuition. I think they're different. I think intuition is talking about subconscious systems making decisions or informing your decision. You can use a bit of both.
Yeah.
And that's really important.
Maybe it's the experience informs the intuition.
But I think that there's also a part of this process. We've talked about creativity and free thinking quite a lot. I think if you ask creatives, artists, often they rely more on their subconscious than their conscious thought to be creative. And I'm thinking back to when I was training to go to Afghanistan, and then when I was in Afghanistan. When I was training to go, the people that had been previously to Afghanistan that were training us, the directing staff, were talking about their experiences in Afghanistan or Northern Ireland or previous conflicts. And then I found it myself when I went out there, and they would talk about this sixth sense, this hairs on the back of your neck standing up, and you don't quite know why, but something is wrong. And they said there are these moments where you can't put your finger on it, but you know something is about to happen. You know you're about to get ambushed, or you know there's a roadside bomb in front of you. And it's not because you've looked at the ground and you've consciously said, that's a vulnerable point, let's check it. There is something happening in your subconscious. Now, that's not magic. It's not somehow in my soul, I know. It's my actual senses, but it's my subconscious brain interpreting them. And it's happening faster than my conscious brain is working out the change. Normally, in retrospect, you can think about it and go, do you know what? There were less people around. I hadn't noticed it. My subconscious had. But it absolutely happened to me probably numerous times where just before something happened, I knew something was about to happen, and without being able to put my finger on it, I would stop the patrol, or I'd say we need to check, we need to get the metal detectors out and check, and we'd find a device, or I think we're about to get ambushed, and I would tell everybody to get ready. These things, it's not magic. It's not a sixth sense. It is the subconscious brain using experience to tell you things. And there's a really interesting example of where our subconscious brain is absolutely better than our conscious brain at doing things, and that's spatial recognition. If I throw a ball at you, you will instinctively catch it.
Sorry, no, I won't.
You will instinctively put your hand out.
Just to ruin your example, but yes, I know what you mean. No, but the mathematics we're doing...
We catch balls because of our subconscious muscle memory. We have learned the feeling of where to put our hand, the muscle movements. What we're not doing is consciously working out the trajectory of the ball, making an estimate of how fast the ball is going, thinking about how much I need to move. It's instinctive. We are better at using our instinct, our intuition, to do things like reversing a car into a car parking space. If you overthink the problem, you end up trying to I'm going to try and judge the distance and think about the maths and actually, sometimes you're better to just use your intuition, use your experience, and use that subconscious spatial recognition. Reading people's facial features. We have evolved to get cues from how people are reacting to us when we're interacting with them, having conversations, and subconsciously recognizing that. And sometimes we're not even aware we're doing it. In fact, most of the time we're probably not aware we're doing it. So there is an element of intuition being a really useful tool. However, it is useful for the things we have evolved it to be useful to do, and not that useful, as I said before the break, for where to invest my money in the stock market.
Let's go back to almost where this episode, the genesis of this episode, which was, you said to me, have you seen Moneyball?
Yes.
And so dutifully, I went away and did my homework, and I watched Moneyball. For those of you who haven't watched Moneyball, you really should. It's actually very, very good. Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill.
Yeah.
And at a very high level, it is based on a true story. It is based on an American baseball team in the US, Los Angeles team. I can't remember now. It was a while. Oakland.
I'm going to look it up.
Not the Raiders. Anyway, it is a baseball team. And given that this is sort of professional baseball, the rules of baseball back then were a little bit similar to the rules of football in the UK today.
It's the Oakland Athletics.
The Oakland Athletics.
In 2002.
And the way things worked generally were the amount of money you spent on the team would directly impact their success. And the challenge that the Oakland Athletic team had and the coach had was they did not have enough money to go buy the players that they felt would go win the team. And in fact, there's a huge scouting team who go away and, get this, use a lot of intuition with a bit of experience on saying, you should have these people on the team. They will be great players. And the whole sort of fundamental point of the film is this young, frankly, we would call him now a data scientist, Jonah Hill, comes to the team and he says, actually, never mind the intuition of people picking players. I can look at the data of these players, and by understanding what results we need to create, we can create a team that will win. And of course, unsurprisingly, because it's based on data, the team they create is one that everyone thinks is a disaster. In fact, they pick people who play oddly. They pick people who have been dropped by lots of other teams because of injuries, all sorts of reasons why people said, this is terrible, you're going to destroy the team. And you see as the team starts to generate success. And the whole principle of the film is about this idea that if you understand the data and you apply the data scientifically, you can create results that outweigh what you beat everyone else.
You beat the judgment.
You beat the judgment.
You beat the judgment of experts.
And so this goes back to this idea of, well, we should go with data and not intuition. And of course, I think what we're really finding here is, in fact, I'm going to cheat. Here's my concluding thoughts for this episode is, it turns out like everything else in the world, we can tell you the recipe. You should have a good amount of data, a good amount of experience, and a bit of intuition. None of that will be useful for you because it comes down to the individual human being based on the context to bring it all together. Why am I saying this? So fantastic. This film is all about, if you use data, you can create a baseball team that will outperform people who have, in inverted commas, better, more expensive players. It turns out he did it for one season and he never repeated it. And so it turns out, yes, he was right, but also it isn't just as simple as if you crunch the numbers, it'll all work out. So there's some fascinating things.
Yeah, and there's a couple of points about the Moneyball example is really good because it was at a time, it was 2002. So if we think back, it's just after the dot-com boom. It's at the late 90s, early 2000s, where the internet is only just sort of becoming a mainstream thing, and people having access to the data.
Yeah, that was
people
novel.
People being able to use big data is quite new. It only worked for one season for two reasons. Well, there's probably an element of luck as well in there, of course, but the two reasons are everybody else did it from then on, and they did that combination of what worked previously in terms of having the right talent scouts. But now, as Richard Feynman says, they're asking better questions and they're asking them at better times. So they're combining big data with their previous experience and wisdom in order to create the best optimum balance.
How fascinating. Isn't that the perfect comparison between AI isn't going to win, but AI paired with human beings is going to win? Big data in baseball isn't going to win.
Yeah.
Big data paired with human beings is going to win. It's exactly the same.
It is exactly the same. What I think was really interesting is, and the second reason is, what the data did, or what use of the data did, was it highlighted traits that previously had been ignored, that now talent scouts without the data could then go and look for. So it removed some of the biases. So one of the things that talent scouts were doing before the Oakland Athletics did their thing was they were looking for the things that look good in an athlete. So do they have the right BMI? Do they look good on the field? Do they you? Do they look like an athlete? And what the Oakland Athletics realised was that lots of very, very good players who have good pitching ability or good batting ability or good sprinting ability, but don't look like they do, are being ignored. They're being dropped. And so there are these people that are falling through the cracks who are brilliant athletes, but because they don't look like it, are being ignored. What the big data allowed the Oakland Athletics to do was identify those people. Subsequently, the talent scouts using just judgment are now able to ask different questions. And in reality, what is now happening, and in all, major competitive sport, especially where there's an awful lot of money in the betting markets, in the branding, in the TV rights and all the rest of it, are using this combination of huge amounts of data, down to personal data from wearables and medical data of individual players, all the way through to the performance data of the team and all of the stuff that goes with it, with those human factors of wisdom, experience and intuition to try and find where the gaps are.
There's something that feels makes me uncomfortable, and I mean that in a way that I'm curious about why I feel uncomfortable. It implies that everything is preordained, that it almost suggests that if the data will tell us everything, when if we go back to my ludicrous example of Marines cartwheeling or giggling in boxes,
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you know what I mean? It makes me a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It says we're almost there was a world. This is going to make me sound old. There was a time when people's ideas and imagination were the thing that people focused on first. And it almost feels like we've squeezed that out for the data. Now, that's not to say there isn't imagination and creativity, but rather than saying, can you imagine something that we don't know whether it will work or not, or can we just go to the data and pick a thing we know will work? We seem to move towards that. Am I being romantic about this?
No, I don't think so at all. I think this is exactly the point. I think it's about using the data to understand as much as you can, but also recognizing where the limits of that are and then finding the gaps. So if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a business, you're trying to work out how the data is going to give you the optimum performance, but then recognize that everybody probably has access to this data. Everybody has use of AI. If you're writing an essay, if you're writing a book, there is so much writing out there because everybody can write now. AI can just do it for you, but everything is a bit bland. So if you're writing a book, the trick now is to work out what makes you different. What is going to make you interesting as opposed to the bland kind of standardized optimum AI content. So there's so much thought leader bullshit out on LinkedIn now because everybody can just go, I want to create a LinkedIn and feels the pressure to do so. So what makes you different? And it goes back to what I was saying about this academic and the essays. The things that make us human and make us stand out are potentially where the gaps are. If you're a business, if you're an entrepreneur, AI will be able to identify from the data there are gaps and they'll get filled. So it's those creative things that are new and novel. If you're a military commander, if you're a soldier, the data will tell you where targets are. The data will be able to work on helping you do what you've done previously. What do I need to do novelly to break?
Well, that
to change the game.
That seems to me to be such an important point, which is the data is the past. I'm going to use this incorrectly, but it is a lagging indicator of what has happened. It tells you about past patterns.
Yep.
What the data in itself cannot do, and arguably, I think it's fair to say now, AI cannot do, is then be novel. It's basically it is remixing what has already happened.
Yeah.
Whereas there is a different world which is novel, which says we have never done this before, and no one has considered it, and we're going to try it.
Yeah.
And you look through history and inventions, and there's a load of these, which is, what do you mean fly? You can't fly. Oh, well, I'm going to have if you use the previous data, the previous data would have told you there is no one flying, you cannot fly.
Yeah. So there are examples of where AI is starting to be novel. So in medical science, they are starting to look at new ways of folding proteins. They're looking at new.
I would argue, though,
combinations
that's a variation on old ways of folding proteins.
Well, but I mean, we're now getting into the philosophical debate of, is all novelty, recombining old ideas? Probably. What I would argue, though, is if we're talking about data versus intuition, is that just an automated machine intuition where we're starting to say, here's all the previous pattern data, here's some new approaches, we're going to trial some new ways of doing things to see what happens. It's experimentation. I think you get into a sort of philosophical debate that probably isn't relevant. The point is, you can't just mathematically solve the problem. You have to experiment. You have to trial. There is a really good counter example of one of the first examples of data-driven medical science was in London, and there was an outbreak of cholera. And at the time, people didn't really understand what caused cholera, and there was all sorts of intuition-driven remedies. So it's about bad smells, so people would cover themselves in perfume. But what they didn't understand, because this is well before the science had got there, is it's about bacteria. But what a particular doctor did was create a heat map of where the cases took place.
Right in the middle.
And right in the middle was a well. And from that, they realized, or they deduced, that well was infected water. They shut that well down, and then all of a sudden. So the data there allowed them to beat intuition. So I think there are examples of where data can give you that. In the same way that there are computers now on the battlefield that will tell you very, very quickly what your firing solution is for your artillery piece if you know where the target is. Far better than doing the logarithmic tables that we used to do to work out the trajectory, and then you'd wind the wheel to get the elevation, and it's all automated. Far, far better than a human, far quicker than a human. That particular decision. But of course,
someone needs to know, do you still want to fire there?
Is it the right target? Is a human, at the moment, it's a human and human machine decision process where, is it a real target? Is it deception? Is the effect of firing on that target going to help me get towards my strategic goals? These are human and human machine dynamics.
Well, let's bring this home. The whole premise of the conversation was data versus intuition. I think there's a number of things we feel pretty confident about, and then there's some bits in the middle which are a little bit harder and maybe still is the magic. The idea that it is only about the data, I don't think either of us believe.
No.
The idea that it's only about intuition, we don't believe. It's somewhere in the middle. It's the combination of these two, which has always been important and will always be important. The doctor had to get the data, but it was the doctor that said, I see what this data means and I can make
Yeah.
There is a huge amount of data, and you need to look at a variety of forms of data to get a good picture. Sort of otherwise, look, I've got this hairy thing, that's the leg of an elephant kind of an idea. That in itself poses problems. The complexity, the time, the cost to gather this information. You could gather all the information and not actually make any decisions. And so it's the humans deciding which is the smallest, most valuable set of information to help me make a good decision. This is the bit, in the middle that's hard. That's really difficult to know. The data I capture today might not be useful for the information I need tomorrow, that's hard. There's this balance of trusting the data, but fusing the data. We talked about that as a challenge. He sort of casually glossed over it. I've got data from 12 sources. How do I combine that data and generate an insight? That's difficult. We didn't we talked about the danger of just relying on intuition. What we didn't talk about, and this is another big piece of Moneyball, is the challenges with human beings, where people in Moneyball, they said, this is how we have always done it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's human beings using intuition in a different way and saying, I don't like the data, or I don't trust the data. I think where we land is, and I think we land on this every week pretty much, is the simple premise that we've just outlined of don't just trust the data or don't just trust intuition. That's the really easy bit. The really hard bit is you can have a room full of people who agree with us entirely, and still only a small group will be truly successful, because it's how you make good decisions on a day-by-day basis, how you make your judgment, how you use the data, how you don't get stuck in a rut, how you evolve, how you change. It's almost, for me, this is a nice way to finish it, which is when someone says, tell me how you use data, make decisions, I find it very hard to make a concise answer to that question, because honestly, it starts with, well, it depends, which no one wants as an answer. But that's where I land. Maybe that's the superpower, is the person who says it depends. In this case, I would do this. In this case, I would do that. And understanding this is complexity. This is complicated.
So I think three things. One is knowing what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve, because that will help you work out what's important. Prioritization is really, really important. Second thing is knowing what type of problem you face. So is it complicated? Is it complex? Is it chaotic? And the third thing is trust in data. So this idea of, do you trust the data? It's very easy to say, the data says this is what we're going to do. It's also very easy to say, I don't trust the data, that's not what we're going to do. If you think about the scientific method is to say, where's the evidence? How can I don't trust that evidence. I need to repeat it. I need to test it. The scientific method is effectively constantly trying to prove the science wrong. And until you can't prove it wrong to, a degree with which everybody kind of comes to a consensus, that doesn't mean that is fact. What it means is, until we improve our knowledge, this is the foundation of our understanding. Everything is always skeptical. So there's a really important point about not just blindly trusting the data, but also not blindly rejecting the data because you don't understand it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, this is a language you've heard me talk about, which is when people say to me, pick one thing you want from a great product person. Terrible question, by the way, but let's say that is the question. Curiosity. I think
a healthy dose of skepticism as well. But to finish, I would also say, I think most people will be able to relate to this. Sometimes having optimized data overwhelms us. Sometimes it doesn't. It depends what we're trying to achieve. So Netflix or other streaming platforms, how many people have sat down with their loved one, their partner, their friends, stuck the TV on and then had a half hour, 40-minute session of flicking through stuff and failing to decide what to watch because there's too much choice. The algorithms are suggesting things, but it's not just, I don't quite feel it, or I disagree with my partner. And ultimately, 40 minutes later, you just settle on something, and what you could have done was just settle on something straight away. So again, it's, what's the purpose? Do you just want to sit down and watch something? Or do you want to watch the right thing? And do you have 40 minutes to waste? Sometimes too much data is unhelpful. Sometimes data is really, really important, and we don't think about it enough. What's the most expensive thing you've ever bought?
A house.
A house.
How long did I take?
How long did you take
house?
to decide? How much data did you?
About 25 minutes.
Yeah, and how much data did you get?
Not very much.
No.
Stop saying that. I feel really bad now.
So a friend of mine is going through, they're selling their house and they're looking to buy, I said, look, in the military, when we make these kind of decisions, this is what we do. And we put a map out because, visualizing the terrain is easy. And we do what we call intelligence preparation of the environment. So we say, right, where do we want to go? How far do you need to be within where you work? Well, I need to be within an hour. Cool. So is that driving? Is that by train? It's a combination. Right. Well, now we can start to draw, a circle or a box, and then we can say, right, well, there are trains here, so what's the walking distance to train? And the circle changes shape.
And what other things do you need? A Waitrose or a McDonald's? By the way, I'm describing exactly how we decided to end up where we are.
If you've got children, local schools, and these are really obvious. And these are things that people think about when they buy houses. What about the rollout of 5G? What's that going to look like in this area? Is that going to matter to you in a couple of years' time? You can look at this stuff. I mean, that information is available.
Rachel must be so annoyed when you were looking for a new house and you got out all these statistics.
What a crime rate. What does traffic look like on a Monday morning? What does aircraft noise? What are the neighbours like? You could, if you wanted, you could spend days just thinking about the questions to ask. And you can build what I would call an intelligence collection plan, a very military way of doing it. You can break these questions down to answerable things. You can go and find the information, which is publicly available. The police have crime statistics. The government have statistics about rollouts of 5G. All of this stuff is available. You can go, and then you can go and observe activity and behavior. The point is, most people spend about 25 minutes looking on online platforms to find the house from a list.
Yeah, but you just described a new service where we go and you ask 10 questions.
And they spend about 15 minutes on average when they do a viewing, and they've already decided within the first 4.5 minutes if they're buying the house or not.
Well, on that bombshell, that it turns out that with all the data we have available, it turns out even for the most important things in life, we're a bit crap. Let's call that for this week. That's been such an interesting conversation. And the next time I'm asked in an interview, which is an hour long, tell me your approach to data, I will refer them to this hour-long podcast, which will please them not in the slightest. But really, really interesting. And I hope, look, we clearly are not going to answer questions for you. We cannot give you that template, but hopefully we've given you a few things to think about in terms of your approach to data and intuition, and at least given you some constraints by which if you're in these areas, that's probably not a good place to be. I think this gets to the heart of the human beings practicing with the right data, but still applying themselves. It's really, really hard. Anyway, I really enjoyed that. Thank you, Gareth. And thank you for sending me off to watch Moneyball. Sure. I'm going to try and think of an excuse for an episode where I send you off to watch Top Gun and Top Gun 2, because that's an excuse for me to go watch those.
I have seen both those movies, but I will rewatch them.
Well, we have to. We'll have to think what episode, what topic can we do? Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Battling with Business. If you have enjoyed it and you have not yet subscribed, please do. And then that way on Thursdays, you will receive a new episode into your podcast inbox. If you've listened to us before and you've already subscribed, don't forget there are now over 100 earlier episodes where we talk about all sorts of interesting things with all sorts of interesting guests. So if you've got 5 minutes, go back and look at the earlier catalogue. There will be something that either you'd forgotten or perhaps you hadn't heard or will tweak your interest. Please also do tap friends on the shoulder who think like you and are interested in these topics and point them towards Battling with Business. Every week we post the new episode on Twitter, Blue Sky, and on LinkedIn, so you can follow us there on the various platforms. But for the moment, thank you very much for joining us with Battling with Business, and we look forward to speaking to you again very, very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Cheerio.